able to have Giovanni Peri here today, who for many years was a colleague of mine at the university. He's the chair in the economics department, professor of economics. Lots of impressive things, director of the Global Migration Center. But to me, what's really impressive is the research he's done over close to the last 30 years on the impacts of immigration on our economy. And I think it's something that needs to be infused into the discussions and understood well by people who want to understand how immigration impacts our daily lives and the economies in which we live. And so I'm hoping that by sharing his knowledge with all of us, who many of us are not economists, we can start to infuse that into the larger narrative in a more meaningful way. So without further ado, let me give the stage to Giovanni. Thanks, Giovanni.
Thank you. Thank you. It's a great pleasure to be here, and thank you for coming and sharing this time with me. I have a presentation. I will try to make it more like a story, but it's a story that the data tell about what immigrants are, what they have been in the US economy, and how they have done. So overall, I want to start next saying that the history of immigrants in the US is a long history. If you just take, I will not show any equation, but I will show you graphs, a lot of graphs. Hopefully they will help carry across the idea. So if you look at the history of the United States, even just starting in 1990, so 130 years ago, and you look at what percentage of the US population was first generation immigrants who came and second generation their kids, you see that already at the beginning of the 1900s, 1/3 of the US population was either immigrant or their children. Then this number declined a lot in the 1920s with reform and then started growing again. But one thing that this graphic shows is that first, long history of immigration. Second, we're not in a time which is unprecedented. We have been in a similar time and even in a time of bigger immigration. Just as long as the history of immigrants is the history of Americans' attitude toward immigrants. Next, Brad. So the US has always had this awareness that we are special countries because we are made of immigrants. So from the 1900s to John Kennedy to the Schoolhouse Rock melting pot there are things, these are images that move the hearts of Americans and make us think we are special because so many immigrants came. But next, at the same time, there is also always been a line that says immigrants are the source of our problems. And I want to emphasize that a lot of this, so these are the so-called socialist, mafia, anarchists coming in the 1900s, this invasion of immigrants, the Italians should not be allowed in, and of course all the up to these days. This often comes from a fear that immigrants are different and they are taking something from us. Keep that in mind because the economics of it is important. A lot of these rhetorics come, they make us less. And I will show you a data story that tells us that immigrants make us more in reality, make us more, not just the immigrant themselves, but people who are already here. Next. So what I will say, first I will show you something about immigration in the world. We need to know a couple of facts about immigration in the world to know who the immigrants are. And then I will talk about immigrants and the economy of the US, what immigrants do to jobs, wages, what immigrants do to American innovation, science, technology. And then I will zoom a little bit on refugees, which is a particular group that I've been studying particularly in the recent year. There are a lot of economic immigrants in the US who come from many reasons, but the refugees are the ones who come from the most messed up countries, if you want to use this word. They come from countries that really have war, that really have situation. And honestly, until recently, I thought we absorb so many immigrants and they bring so much that we can even be generous with the refugee, even if they don't bring as much. But in reality, they do. In reality, they do incredibly well, them as well, included with immigrants. And then I will say a couple of words. That was good, about recent evolution. So 4 facts with 4 graphs here. First, How many immigrants are there in the world? Is it common to be immigrants in the world, or is it an exception? And it turns out there is a big exception to be an immigrant. In the whole world population, only a little bit more than 3% of the people are immigrant. Immigrant meaning people who are born in a country and move to another country to work, family. So immigrants are a small group. But why has immigration become so much of a huge issue, especially in the US, Europe, and rich country? Because one channel of migration has grown a lot in the last 30 years. In fact, people moving from non-rich country to more developed country has increased. And so actually, let's go to the next. So I show you the graph. So this is the immigrant as a percentage of the total population that came to the two biggest destinations, Europe, Western Europe in purple, and the United States. And this number went from 4% of the population to about 12, 13, 14% of the population. So a big growth, but over a long time. It's not that it happened in a moment. And in particular, if you just look at immigrant that came from non-rich country, less developing country, emerging country, and came to rich economy, the US, which is the red is the one that has attracted the largest group of immigrants. Europe also is attracting a lot of them, but a little bit less. So immigrants from non-rich to rich country came in large number. The second fact, though, to understand who these immigrants are, is that immigration the large migration countries are not the poorest countries of the world. They are the mid-income countries of the world. In fact, if you look at poverty, country in deep poverty is an obstacle to migration. You need to move somewhere else to have a little savings, have a plan, have a little bit of money to buy the ticket. So from the real poorest part of the world, there is less immigration, while the intermediate income countries are the ones that generate more. The next graph illustrates this. And this graph is, just look at the black line, is the relationship between income per capita of a country, so how rich is a country, and how many people, vertical, migrate out of the country. So you see that countries which are very poor, Chad, Afghanistan, sub-Saharan African countries are very poor, have relatively small out-migration rate. This grows until countries get to an income that is at the level of the Philippines. Mexico, for instance, has reached the level of income from which you had a lot of immigrants in the past. Now you don't. I will talk about Mexican migration in the US has declined massively in the last 10 years. They are not anymore the migrants that come to the US. And then when you are rich, again, you don't migrate because you stay where you are. So here, more wealth for countries which are more very poor means normally more migration because people start being connected. And only after a certain level, then people don't. So
what are the different colors?
These colors mean total migration of these people, and this dark blue is migration to rich country, and this is migration poor to poor. So in particular, the migration towards rich country has this hump shape there. This is the aggregate, and this is the component to rich and to non-rich migration country, out migration. Okay, so migrants from middle-income country. Who are the migrants? So a lot of study over and over again also talks about migrants tend to be people who are relatively good in terms of education, in terms relative to people who don't migrate from their own country. So normally, economy says migrants are in general highly positively selected in terms of migration. And also when we can measure other characteristics, how much they are willing to take a risk to succeed, how much adaptable they are, how is their health, normally they're also positively selected in that respect. So relative to people who don't migrate from this middle income country, the people who make it are a little bit more educated, a little bit more adaptable, a little bit more willing to start something new, to take initiative. The next graph shows the quantification of this. And again, this is a plot of what is the average number of college educated among immigrants relative to college educated among non-immigrants for each country in the world. And you see that above this line means that migrant, people who go out of the country, so emigrant, people who go out, are more educated relative to the people left behind. And there are some countries in which the out migrant are way more educated than people who stay. So India is up here. In the Indian diaspora in the world, 70% of the people are college educated, but in India, only a little bit less than 10%. But all the countries have their people who come from this country and are abroad to be more educated than people that don't come, sometimes much more educated. So people come from intermediate income country, and normally they're better educated than people who are not moving. And then the last fact is that the US is a little special among all countries in terms of what kind of immigrant the US attracts. In fact, the US attracts immigrants from the whole range of country, education level, and skill level. In particular, the US attracts a lot of the brains and a lot of the workers. This is, and the US has a super strong pool for people who are scientists, engineers, technologists, who are migrants. Sometimes they come from not rich country and come from the US. If you listen to every year when they give the Nobel Prize, this year they have awarded already, except for economics, all the Nobel Prize. The US got 5 Nobel Prize, 1 in chemistry, 2 in physics, and 1 in physiology. Of these 5 people, go see their bios. 3 of them were born, 1 is Jordan, 1 is in France, 1 is in England. At the top of the US science, there is a lot. The US doubles its ability to innovate and do science because of these people. And this is something that the US has more than almost any other country. So let's go to the next. And here you see that if you compare the growth of immigrants in US and Europe, so the red and the purple, while in terms of high school educated, so less skilled, they are called in these people who don't have a college education, Europe and the US grew in the same way, but in terms of people who have a college education, the US has grown much more than Europe. So that now the US has about 7% of its population which are immigrant without college, and 7% of its population who are immigrant with college. So a very balanced. So next, to summarize, and if you want to look at how immigration to the US has looked like in the last 40 years, the other thing that is interesting and not very many people realize is that this is the number of immigrants without, the red is without a high school degree, and the blue is with a college degree. And this is just the number of immigrants in the United States. So in the 70s, 80s, 90s, and 2000, the US increased massively the number of less educated and high educated immigrants. These are the intermediate group. And then after 2000, actually, the highly educated have increased much more. The US has slowed down in attracting the workers in a sense, but the professional, the scientists and engineers have gone up. And again, maybe you have heard a lot about the massive increase in immigration that has been in 22, 23 during the Biden administration. And there was, but in the big picture is this blip that you see up towards the end. The 2023 was the largest year of immigration. But if you take it in historical perspective, there was not a particularly massive amount of immigrants. The US has had an increase of immigrants throughout, and the college educated have increased a lot in the last 25 years. Next. In particular, if you look at where immigrants are in the US, and if you go up and up in the more sort of high human capital type of jobs, the percentage of immigrants becomes more and larger and larger. About 15% now of the US population is immigrant, but if you take people with college degree who work in science, technology, engineering, and math, that was STEM in science, technology, engineering, but more than 20% are immigrants. And then if you look at PhD, in STEM, more than 35% are immigrants, and the more you go, the more you find a concentration. So at the high end of the spectrum, there is this big increase in presence of immigrants. Okay, so the US has this very broad range of immigrant brains, people who work. And now, and in summary, in the world, people who have motivation, they are highly educated relative to the people who don't go, who are selected, are migrant, and out of this, the US has been in this special position to attract a lot of people from the rest of the world. So what do these immigrants do to the American economy? Okay, those are the immigrants. So I don't want to do any theory, but I want to give you an intuition. What you hear a lot is that immigrants take American jobs and immigrants crowd the American economy. So this is a concept that in the powerful myth is that there is this mass of people who are just undifferentiated workers. They come in, and because our resources are constrained, they're going to crowd us and they're going to decrease what is in there. So this is a way of looking at economics, which was true with Malthus. I don't know if you've ever heard his name. Sometimes people who are talking about economics only know about Malthus, who was this 1800 economist who said the world is doomed because with land limited, the more you cultivate the land, the less will be the product of the land. We're not in the Malthus economy anymore. We are in an economy which is more complex, where wealth comes from investment, technology, growth, productivity, that needs a number and a variety of workers. In fact, in our world, more worker, more skills, more ability means more productivity, not less. Think of all the ideas you need in order to open new markets. You create a new iPhone, a new product for the heart disease. Those are people, new people who think, new people who are needed to produce these goods. So the evidence of economy is that instead immigration is a differentiated skill of people, not a uniform skill mass, in a world where technology, complexity, investment, and growth needs people from all these different type of abilities. And the economics of immigration is really not an economics of more people, less productivity. It's an economic where more people means more innovation, more human capital, more ideas, more variety, more goods, and therefore more wealth and income per capita. So in the next, there is the graph. If you are a Malthusian economist, this is the number of workers in your plot of land, and this is the productivity of your land. The more worker you have, the more they crowd the land, the less productive you are. But if instead you think of economies like ours, which are made in cities, in urban centers, where its production comes from bringing people together, the more people you have in this type of economy, the more you can specialize in different type of good, the more you can produce variety of good. Just start thinking about the variety that comes from having more people. How many restaurants variety of restaurants would we have? What variety of entertainment, movies without that chunk of people? Those are sectors that create a lot of value added, and they all work like this. More people, more diversity, more productivity per person. So let's go to the next. And one important thing is that in this economy of ideas, innovation, creativity, diversity, immigrants play a very important role. First, a lot of immigrants are found disproportionately in fast-growing, high-productivity cities. Think of not just the US, New York and Los Angeles, but Canada, the UK, Singapore. These are large local economies with a lot of immigrants. And second, they are a crucial part of this dynamic. More people, more variety, more demand, more specialization and differentiation, and more growth. So if we look at the next picture that gives an idea, this is how differentiated has been the growth of immigrants in the US over 50 years. Some big, very productive cities in the East, New York, Boston, the DC area, Atlanta, part of Texas, the West have had a lot of immigrants. They are much fewer. If you think about the geography of growth, of economic development, of innovation in the US, is pretty much very similar to this. The places which did not have a lot of immigration are also places which tend to be more stagnant, slower growing. But if you look, and this is a graph, if you plot the share of foreign born and the density of cities, which is a measure of how many people come to the city, how successful this city are, you see that the small city in the US attract very few immigrants. As a percentage, so of course in number, if you're a small city, you have fewer people, but as a percentage of your population, 0 to 3%. But in the large city, New York, Los Angeles, Chicago, and San Jose, and all these other, in the largest city, 20, 30, 40% of people are immigrants. immigrants go in the high productive, high growth city. What about the relationship between the growth, cities that have grown more in terms of employment and size, and growth in their immigrant share? The same. Cities which in the period 2000 to 2019 have grown more, they also have attracted in percentage more immigrants. They have had more immigrants. Okay, maybe it's true that in large cities there are this, but what about the wages of the American worker? So you have these guys who have spent his whole life, Stephen Miller, maybe you don't know it if you do immigration, you know him since 2006, saying that immigrants, low-skilled immigrants are the worst thing that can happen to American worker. When you crack down on immigrants, you increase wages. I don't know where he gets his data to say these things, but probably not the same place where I get it, because if you look at the constant evidence, and I'm going to just put some plot, some graph, over and over again, you see that the labor market where more immigrants are, more low-skilled immigrants are the same, where the wage of American worker has grown faster. Now, I will say a word, this doesn't mean that they cause the growth of American wage to go up. And there are many other papers that show that they cause part of this. And I will tell you why they cause part. But if you go to the scatter plot, this is a scatter plot of growth of immigrants and growth of American wages across American cities, labor market, in the 80s, in the 90s, in the 2000s, in the 2010s. If it's true that more immigrants push down wage, this should be a negative relationship. More immigrants come in, less. While every decade, and for every study that we do, there is a positive, very often statistically significant and large. One means that 1% more immigrants in that group means over the period 1% per year faster growth of American worker, or is associated with 1% per year more growth. Two things that people always ask, so I just, are you counting the undocumented in this analysis? Yes, because the US Census until now, unless it's changed, has reached all the people who are resident in the US, no matter what's their status. So when I count how many people come in each place, I count documented and undocumented. That's important. Second, wages, when I talk about wages here, I talk about real wages, wages corrected for inflation. So this is real purchasing power that goes to people. And in places where there are more immigrants, this is stronger. So why? How is it possible that we are not in the Malthusian world? Why more immigrants can be higher wage for native? So the first reason is related to that fact that I told you before, that we need a variety of skill to produce anything that we want to produce in our economy. And specialization brings more productivity. So if I am a person in a restaurant and I run a restaurant and I have to be both the manager, the waiter, the person who wash the dishes, and the person who sends out the flyer, I'm going to be splitting my time in an efficient way. But if they can hire a person who does dishes, a person who's a waiter, a person who's a manager, and I can do my supervisory and advertisement, the productivity of all four of us goes up a lot. Immigrants do jobs which are, in general, specialize in jobs which are different from American. They tend. So if they are highly educated, as I told before, immigrants tend to be in science, technology, engineering, and math. And they don't tend to be very much in management, human resources, organization, law. Well, you can think why, right? Because math, physics, and chemistry is the same everywhere in the world, but knowing the American laws, knowing the American culture, knowing the American language gives a little bit of an advantage to native. This is a concept which is very powerful for economy. It's called comparative advantage. That's all economics is based like this. If each one specializes in jobs where we have comparative advantage, the productivity and the efficiency of everybody goes up. Among non-college educated who do jobs, immigrants tend to do much more manual intensive, physical intensive jobs, and less jobs which are related to supervision, communication. But you need all of these jobs in order to make the economy grow. And so when you have more immigrants and these jobs are all needed, economy says that these jobs are complementary to each other. So when you have more immigrants, you need more Americans doing the complementary job. Again, think of a construction company. Or the construction sector is a very important sector that is responsible for growth in many places. And in that sector, you definitely need manager, engineer, but you need construction worker, people who sales the apartment once they are done. And if some of these roles are more, the blue one that I marked are the one where more Americans are, and the red are where more immigrants are, if you specialize and separate, you're going to get more. And even within a sector, right, as I was saying before, think of food and hospitality. Not only do you need different people, but the food and hospitality which is produced by foreign-born is a bit different. They have different tastes. They produce different food. They produce different ambience and environment. So this increases the variety. So the first is that immigrants are a variety, increase the variety of labor. The second is that immigrants create firms and therefore job, so create companies, which are what we need to create jobs, at a rate which is significantly higher than Americans. Immigrants are likely to be entrepreneurs at a rate which is 3 to 5 times higher than Americans. Why is that? Well, my favorite explanation is that to migrate, the act of going to another country, you need to have some characteristics that then are similar to the one that makes you a good entrepreneur. You need to be more willing to take a risk. You need to be willing to value what will happen in the future in order to pay a cost at the present. You need to be willing to connect and adapt to situations. If anybody knows an entrepreneur, those are also some of the characteristics that make an entrepreneur more effective. And the next graph, again, is from one of my studies. So here, this is the rate at which you create firms. Divided by size of the firm. How likely is that a person create a firm of 1 worker with 3 workers, a firm that eventually will have 1,000 workers? And this is the probability that an immigrant will create that type of firm, and that's the probability that a native will create that type of firm. It's a log scale, so this small difference is a 3-time difference, in fact. So how likely is that an American will create a firm with at least 1 person? So we'll just have a little own person company. 3 Americans out of 1,000 create such a company, but almost 8 immigrants out of 1,000. How likely is that an American, US born, create a company with 1,000 plus jobs, that create 1,000 plus jobs? Well, only 3 out of 1,000,000 Americans create this, but almost 8 out of 1,000,000. And for any size, you see that is more likely to for a foreign born to create this. So this is true for the mom and pop shop, as well as for the, well, if you know the names of people who have created Google, who have created, you know that many of them are foreign born, in fact. And the next come from this recent paper that I have, taking all the students who did a master in the United States and look at how many of them created innovative startup in the 5 years after graduation, using this very comprehensive database and tracking how many American students have created a startup and how many foreign students have created a startup. And again, you see that a difference which is also in the order of 3-4 times. Foreign students after a master in the US are 3 to 4 times more likely to create a company in the US. Keep in mind that it's much harder for a foreign student who does a master to stay in the US. A lot of them have to go back because of visa issues. Not even just now, always in the past. So the fact that they are much more in per capita terms is even more remarkable. Okay. Third, as I told you, immigrants are scientists and engineers in large part. And in the science, technology, engineering, and math world, they have been a very important part. And a lot of people actually have shown not only that they are innovative, but that when they are in team of inventors with US inventors, with other US scientists, they increase the innovativity of American scientists too. Again, if you have worked in science, it's obvious. When you are in a team of chemists, physiologists, not everybody knows everything. You need those crucial people. And if you put together those 4 crucial people, you get the invention. If you're missing the guy who is an expert and is good in one aspect, you're not going to do the invention. So they expand this type of innovation, and inventor increase a lot innovation. So some recent estimate is that 1/3 of the US innovation in terms of patents, in terms of new product, is come from the contribution of these of immigrant workers. This is another plot again. So I guess even if you catch only one thing of this plot that I'm showing is that they're all positive relationship here. This is the relationship with how many foreign-born STEM people you have in a city, and how much is the growth of wages for American college educated and even for other Americans. So let me again tell this concept of multiplier effect. Any job that is put in a place not only is unlikely that displaces jobs because we have need of so much, is likely that it's connected to other job and creates other job. Again, think of one of these scientists or even of a worker that goes in a place. In this place, if you have more people who innovate, you have more labs. Labs also need some staff people, but they need to eat. They need to somebody who cleans where they are. So at the local level, more of these people also mean more demand for people who do all other type of jobs. And this is the positive relationship between more immigrants and more demand for Americans, and so more growth of wage of high-skilled American as well as low-skilled American. And finally, obviously, immigrants are also consumers. They consume, they eat, they use local goods, local services. Not only they spend more in the US economy, but also they spend in a variety of goods which is somewhat different. They demand things which are different. And again, in terms of this increasing the availability of goods and services, this is very important. So all of these things that I've said are things that immigrants do to the local economy and the local community. But one thing that makes sense to think is, another thing that you hear from the rhetoric is that many immigrants come here to take our welfare, to take our government support. And actually, I have to say, and sometimes even people, so these are actually citations taken not from anti-immigrant people, from people who are generous, for people who have observed the integration of immigrants, saying that assimilation is hard for immigrants, it takes time, and sometimes we need to give them cash. The US in this is also an exception in the world. It's true. Immigrants don't integrate as well in all countries in the world where they go. And it's also true that the US has not a lot of program, supporting immigrants. But the US, as I will show you, has had this ability to integrate immigrants of all origin, and even the most disadvantaged, into the US economy, of course, with variation and maybe imperfect, but to an extent that European countries and even Canada has not shown so far. So I want to talk, actually, let's skip this. Let's go to the next directly, because I want to talk about refugees now. In the last 10, 15 minutes, this is a church community. And I don't know if they directly this or other community. Many US communities and church community have been involved in integrating refugees in this gigantic world program, which is called Resettlement of Refugees, that in the US has been supported by a lot of private charity and private group. So a lot of people have used them. And the US, these are people who flee war, who flee extreme poverty, who have been persecuted. This is the graph over 5-year bins of the number of refugees which have been resettled in the United States, divided by country. So you don't see here very well, but remember in the 70s and 80s, we resettled a lot of Vietnamese, Cambodian, Laotian. Then in the 90s and 2000, we started having a lot of people from after the Iran revolution, a lot of people from the ex-Soviet Union Republic. And then in the more recent period, a variety of people from Africa, Democratic Republic of Congo, Syria, of course, in the recent period, Ukraine. These are the refugee. These are the asylum seeker, a slightly different group. Asylum seeker are people who come without already having a refugee status, and they ask. Not all of them become refugees eventually, and this number has increased, and these are the recent flow of Haitian, Venezuelan, Ukrainian, right, that has increased. So several million resettled here and several million over time here. In this study that we have, we follow each group of refugee over 50 years in terms of assimilation in the US. And here again, sorry, it's small there, but there are all the single country that we can follow by time of arrival. We can follow the Vietnamese who arrived in the 75. We can follow the Laotian. And these dark color are where a lot of refugees were. These light where there were a little bit fewer and even fewer. But you see, there are countries like Iran, Somalia, like Sudan, Afghanistan. These are groups that we follow. And I'm going to show you what economists call integration graph of these groups. And the integration graphs are a graph that show relative to Americans, relative to similar Americans, how did they do in different variables. So the first where I want to, this is how likely they are to be employed. And this line that you see are the are the cohort of refugees that arrived. So the one that we can follow for 40 years needs to be people who arrived in the past, while other cohort we only can follow for 10 years, 20 years, depending on when they arrived. But if you look at the picture as a whole, of course, there is some variation of where this cohort starts. But you see that all cohort very fast. What does this mean? That on average, refugee come in the US with 20% less probability of finding a job relative to American. Well, this is already pretty good. The average employment rate of Americans is about 75%. So it means that 55% of them already find it in the very first few years, but still have a gap. Within 10 years, they have essentially reduced the gap to less than 10%. Within 20 years, they have put it to zero, and over the long time, they actually work at a little higher rates than American work. So refugees, they come to the US, and they come from this country, which in many of which it was even hard to work at all. They don't speak English, all of them. They don't really have. They have this ability to catch up and integrate with the US workers, and in terms of US performance, which is extraordinary. Just as a comparison, I put here, in the European countries where they are honestly more generous, in fact, to refugees than we are, this gap is a way bigger. After 5 years, there is a 60 percentage point gap. And even after 10, 20, 12, 20 years, refugees never catch up with workers. So I'm going to show you a couple of other convergence graphs. This is in wages. The wages converge a little slower, but they also converge to where Americans are. So refugees that come at a 20% discount compared to a similar American, after 10 years, they only have a 10%, and after 15, 20 years, less than 5%. This is an incredible amount. And all the cohort, you see, all the cohort is not something that was happening in the 70s and is not happening in the 90s and 2000. All the cohort tend to converge. One thing that they don't converge to, which is interesting on the labor market, it goes back to why they are good for our economy. They converge in employment and in wages, but they continue doing jobs which are different a bit from the American. This is a graph in which in some of these, given that you know the job that they do, you can decompose how much of this job is manual type of tasks. So how much is the job, take the job of cook, how much is chopping, preparing, touching, and how much is instead communicating and talking. So most of these immigrants stay in jobs which are relative to American more manual intensive and a little bit less communication intensive. So the fact that they don't catch up fully in terms of wage is because they do somewhat different jobs than American, and they stay on more manual job. And again, if you know these people, they are more likely to be in the hospitality sector, in the food sector, in the construction sector, in the personal assistance sector, doing a little bit more manual job relative to communication, and that complements what the American do, because the American do more in language intensive jobs, especially in the non-college area. So that's one thing. And then the other thing, we did this study for a lot of variables. The one that strikes me is how much these people want to become Americans. These people, the naturalization rate, what percentage of these people is US citizen? Of course, at arrival, no one. This gap with American is 100%. This is in percentage. But after 10 years only, 80% of these people, and after 20 years, almost, 70%, and then 80%, almost everybody gets a citizenship. Now, these are refugees only, and keep in mind, refugees is the group that we have allowed to legally stay and legally be American, and so the group that we allow to stay continue to improve itself and become similar to American, and many of them go through the test, the exam, become Americans, and stay in the United States. I just want to show you one thing, because I found this surprising. Even if you zoom of people who come from very disadvantaged countries, this is how employment and wage converge from people coming from Sub-Saharan Africa. These are Black people in large part, African, not African American, African people who come to the US, and they, in the first 10 years of they are employed at the same rate as American. In fact, interestingly enough, they do much better than Black born in the United States. The black immigrant have actually this very high. And Southeast Asian, which was that group of Vietnamese and Laotian that everybody knows integrated very well. That is a generation. Integrate, but maybe they do even better than them in some, and also in terms of wages. So this is interesting because, again, I am showing you facts, and on this, while my research has been massively showing that there are these positive effects of Americans, now I'm also seeing that the US is really remarkable in terms of integrating these people. I don't think we know fully why, how, what are the ingredients that made the US such a good integrator of people from all over the world versus Scandinavia, versus Germany, who have invested. But I feel, and there is some evidence that in part this long history, so the fact that people come here and this is a bit a society of other immigrants who have come, plus the involvement of individuals, the involvement of the privates in this, which in Europe, a lot of this assimilation is outsourced to the government, to governments of there. Here, churches, group, voluntary are involved a lot. There is some evidence that this private involvement and this long history and connection of immigrant and presence of immigrants from all over is different. And this is just other two countries. Then I just have 2 more slides and I'm done. And look again. So these are the Europeans. So from Soviet Union coming, they integrate quickly. They are white. They are European. But the Middle East, North African, the Arab, the Muslim, also integrate very quickly, and they overtake in both employment and wage relative to Americans. So these are the Syrians, the Iranians, the Iraqi, the Afghans. These are people who don't sit and wait for checks. They are getting into the labor market, they're working, they're contributing to their local economies. And because of this integration, there are those effects that I showed you before on the local economy, in increasing the productivity, increasing the wages. Okay. Let me conclude with 2 slides that say, okay, I showed you a lot of the past, although all this past ended in 2022, 23, recent past. Maybe the future is different. Maybe all that we have learned for the past, there is a reason to change our attitude towards the immigrant. And maybe in the future, we're not going to benefit anymore, we're going to lose. Well, I'm going to give you one fact that makes us think very seriously that actually the next 2 decades are when we would gain the most from having more immigrants rather than less. And this, again, it's a little clutter figure, I'm going to explain it, comes from the demographic evolution of the US, which we all know. So in the US, after 2020, the labor force, people in the labor force, so between 18, say, and 65-year-old, that group of people has started shrinking as it had never done before in the US history. We always had a group of people who were able to do work expand. And it's shrinking because the big cohort of the baby boomers start retiring and the new cohort coming in are small. So this is, again, this is the growth of people in working age who have a college degree and have a no college degree in the last 3 quinquennial periods. So this is how much our native with a college degree grew in the 10, 14, 15, 19, 20, 23. And we still have enough growth of people with a college degree because the new generation have a college degree. And these are the immigrants. So the immigrants contribute a little bit. But in terms of people who don't have a college degree, there are many more, and there have been many more leaving the labor force in the last decade. Each year we have lost almost 1 million workers who were doing jobs which didn't require a college degree. Maybe some are substituted by technology, maybe some, but these are people who were doing job in construction, in food services, in hospitality. The US has declined this, and the immigrants, which are this bump, little bump of immigrants that we had in the period in the Biden. So this essentially corresponds to in terms of president, this was the Obama period, this is the Trump period, this is the Biden period. And as you see, in the Trump period, but continued in the Biden, we have continued to lose native. And in the first Trump, we also lost some immigrants, but not as many during the Biden period. And now, if in the future these are going to become more and more negative, this is also going to become negative. And so what's going to happen? Here, I have put what are the number of jobs that are not filled by the end of a month, of the average month, in these two sectors, which are very intensive in non-college type of worker, construction and hospitality. And you see, as these people drop out of the labor force, and so far not many people replace them, the probability of having job openings which are unfilled increase over this 3 period significantly. Right now, the economy is a little weaker, so we have a little less of these unfilled jobs, but in an economy that continues to grow, the problem will not be not to generate enough jobs, will be not to have people who will do these jobs, and especially in sectors like construction, hospitality, food, agriculture. Of course, I didn't even put up agriculture because everybody knows that the US agriculture is only dependent on immigrants, but also these other healthcare services, first home care services. If you have an elderly parent, you know how hard it is and how costly, and you know that either if he's in or she is in a home, or if the person is at home, it's very likely that you're gonna stumble on some immigrants who will take care of them. All these jobs are the ones which have a lot of openings and not very many workers. Okay, so this demographic story will say, on top of all the reasons that I said in my slides, they increase the economy, they increase variety, they are innovative, they bring, we will also need just in order to replace the workers who are not in this country anymore. So to conclude, I would say that the economic case for immigration, and some people will say the economic case, they don't like it because they see like the greedy case to have it. The economics that I talk about is economics of being able to provide for yourself, to bring more welfare, to be welfare in the sense of well-being to people. This in this sense, immigrants do contribute to growth, to variety of skill, to innovation. And they themselves, so as much as people are saying, oh, the American dream is over, for that group of refugees that came to the US, decade after decade and generation after generation, they really lived the American dream. They first came here and they could find a job, and over their lifetime, they caught up, starting from earning less. They caught up with American, and sometimes they became better than Americans. I'm sure that everybody of you can think of maybe even a Davis resident who is in one of those groups who has had this trajectory. In the next years, I think the population growth will, the population decline of the US will add another reason to that. And so, again, in a place, in a world in which we do two things. One, we want this country to continue to prosper and be economically successful. But two, also, we think that as people, we have also a responsibility for being part of this future success. I think in a world like this, from a human point of view, from a community point of view, I think that the next years should be years in which we point out what a great place has been the US for assimilation and for making these people not just helping themselves, but helping us in a way that seems to be the key of how economists see these mutual benefits that come from diversity, differences, exchange, specialization, maybe also with a little bit of compassion that comes from the community like this one, rather than going back to that fear and closure that we think is not the way to go forward. That's it.
Well, do you have some time for?
Sure. Yes. Yeah. Of course. Any
Well, I'll tell
reaction?
you, this is powerful. Will this be shared on YouTube
Yes.
on the church? Okay, I'm going to look for it because I got some folks who need to see this.
Thank you. I mean, there is only that much we can reach, so that's a great question. Yes.
So I know this is a generalization, but a large portion of the working class in our country have really bought into the narrative that immigration is bad. Is there some legitimacy to their argument that, given that they have these working class jobs, if you limit the amount of people who come into the country who tend to take these jobs, if they then increase, if you limit that, then it'll increase their wages because of the supply is diminished. So is there
Yeah.
some
So
argument working on?
let me start from this 2 points. One is, remember, one of the graphs that I showed shows that from 2000 to 2025, in the last 25 years, period in which that group of workers done very badly, really not very well, the immigration of this low-skilled immigrant was zero, in fact, while the immigration of the high-skilled was positive. So, while in principle, there are some situations in which if you flood the market with people who are low-skilled, the low-skilled will suffer. In reality, most of the stuff, so what is real is the bad and slow performance of wages of the middle and middle low class. Those wages have stagnated. But they have stagnated relative also to the 90s. In the 90s, they were growing faster. But if you go look at how immigrants came in the 90s was the boom of the less educated and a little less the highly educated. The 2000 and 2010, that group decreased a lot, in fact, was flat. Except for these 2 years, 22, 23 of the Biden administration, that group was very, that's the first thing I think that you need to communicate. In spite of hearing, there has been an invasion, there are millions of them. The reality is that in the last 25 years, that group of workers, foreign workers, inflow has been much smaller, relatively small, relative to the inflow of foreign professional, foreign staff. So in a pure supply, there is no pure supply story that can really work in this case, because in that pure supply story, the college educated should have been the one who suffered. The economy instead has evolved in a way that that group, I would say that a lot of the problem of the middle class in the US come from complicated things like technology, automation, outsourcing in part, but also, decreasing the bargaining power of worker, unionization has gone down. And it's a whole complex of things. I think that what is super powerful of that message is identify a real problem, which is American workers have been suffering in the last 20 years, and identify a solution that is easy to address and makes people feel, at least some, relatively good, because it's not our fault, it's their fault. That's really big. So maybe to talk to these people, we need to walk back and say, let's acknowledge what are the problems, which are real, where there is the pain, which is real. What is the solution to that? I honestly don't think, so if you're asking me, do we want to go to a policy that then admit a lot of low-skilled workers right now? I would say that could have an impact, a negative impact on the low skill, but I don't think anybody is really addressing. Now, the question is, do we want a policy that eliminates, kicks out who is here and eliminates immigration across the board, or instead balance the immigration, which is what US has had in the past, balance high skill and low skill? Will that be beneficial to most Americans, including the working class? I would argue that balanced immigration will be beneficial to most Americans because it will create local growth, local opportunity out of which they can prosper. So I would push back on that narrative very strongly, acknowledging that there are some problems, but I don't think this is even in the top 10 reasons why that is happening. Yes, but
yeah, one other line of research that I've seen recently is the effect on housing prices.
yes, yes.
You want to talk about that a little?
Yes. So in terms of effect of housing prices, that's been another thing. So immigrants, as I showed you, are attracted in large cities, and in some large cities, prices have gone up and they have become. And so again, the immigrants often are kind of pointed out. So many locations have become, when a price increase in a location, most of the time is the result of the success of that location. It's an index that a lot of people want to go there. Why prices have been growing so fast in some metropolis on one end. And on the other is that housing is very constrained. There are a lot of constraints in building new houses. So I would say some people identify the fact that when immigrants go in a place, some housing prices increase. That is true. Just as anybody goes when you have an increase in population, you have an increase in prices. But if you separate between city where the housing supply has increased and city where it has not, you don't observe this effect in cities where the housing supply has accompanied the inflow of people, just not necessarily only immigrants and non-immigrants. The other thing is that most of the effect on housing supply comes more from high-income immigrants rather than low-income immigrants who beat up some of the costs. And again, I would say that the pricing of houses, which is the combination between how many people want a house and how many houses are there, is a result of the incredible constraint on housing building that there is in many big American cities which have been very successful. So again, although the correlation goes in the direction more immigrants, the price of housing is a little bit higher. The reason is that these are economies that have grown a lot, where income have grown a lot, and where the housing is adjusted, there is not this bottleneck effect as well. Yes.
Yeah, question on the education of immigrants. Are they coming because of our education system is good here, or are they coming and then deciding to stay?
So,
yeah.
or they come after education. I would say that a good 60% of immigrants who stay and work are in part educated in the United States. Either they come to do college or they come to do graduate school, and then they stay. Our education system is great. We have some of the top universities in the world that also attract some of the best talent. So the idea that after the US has invested so much in these people, and I always argued that the best way to assimilate immigrants is for them to come here to school. Not only they learn and they are selected based on their ability, but also they learn everything else in school and in college that makes them more assimilated to begin with. So in part is that. There are some also they come to jobs. So it's also true that we have some of the companies who do innovation, especially in high tech, in healthcare, in biotech. So some come after. But I would say a good part of the US story in attracting skilled and college educated is our great education system that attract people here, and the one who we can keep. Normally they tend to contribute quite a lot. Yes.
I'm confused.
Okay.
I mean, there's so many things that come to mind. And in terms of having a balanced immigration policy, what you just said earlier a few minutes ago was people who have skills to be educated. So, how do you get a balance between people who are college educated, who already have skills to be integrated, and people who don't have much of an education, but have skills to be educated?
Yeah.
And then there's the constant evolution of just the dynamics of the economy changing. I mean, now we're all talking about AI, okay?
Right.
But I can think back 30 years ago when my wife's relatives who've been farming in Wyoming for, I don't know, 80 years, and they had people out there setting irrigation tubes, they had families coming in to pick the sugar beets. All of that's on demand. They don't have any workers who do any manual work. Their tractors drive themselves. The irrigation system goes on because of the satellite.
Right. Those jobs are gone, so there is no need for those jobs anymore. So I mean, here, if you put a little bit more economics and labor market demand in the way in which we allow immigrants to come in, a lot of these things will be solved. Because what do you need in most? So first you need to separate people who need a college, some job you need a college, other you don't need necessarily. But then if it's a company, if the company needs a worker, searches locally. If the worker is not found locally and they find somebody from abroad identified with that skill or even that ability, they could generate a visa for them to come in. That's the principle in which the H-1B visa in large part are done in some of the agriculture. You don't need the government to tell you which type of worker. You need the companies. You need just to allow a number of visas. Now, if you want to hire a worker, unless he's a college educated or more, for which this the H-1B, that you need in your home care for elderly. If you need to hire a foreign worker who is in your restaurant, who is in your construction company, you don't have any visa. There is no visa that allows an immigrant without a college degree who is demanded by an American company to come here. The only way to do it, and the way they've done it, is through family reunification. So you need to have a relative in the US. Why should a person who has a cousin, a brother in the US be favored over a person who is in demand from the employer. So what I'm saying is that if we move our system to be more open, in the sense that admitting people for which there is demand determined by the employer, the university, not by the government. The government does not know anything about what is needed, so that it will change. And we allow these people, of course, there is a vetting or something to make sure that the person is not a criminal. That needs to be done by an agency. But if we allow a little bit more of this economic demand to regulate the flow in, we will be much better off. The US policy has been set strict cap, which are not renewed for 20 years, not even consider what is the demand of the US economy. Then, of course, most of the people come in through family reunification and then through work, mostly the highly skilled. So exactly the type of worker that we will need to fill those gaps don't have a way to coming in the US. That's why 11 million undocumented found job in the United States when we were allowing them, because there was big demand, big identification of good ability and skills we needed, but no way to getting these people legal. So I am with you. We need to let a little bit more the US economy respond to incentive and the immigration policy to guarantee order, safety, legality, but some people coming in legally, allowing that to happen. And that's not happening right now.
Well, there was a program on PBS NewsHour this past week where there's a glass company in Idaho, okay, who sponsor and recruit workers. And I think about a third of their workforce, they have several manufacturing, but in this one plant they have 700 workers. A third of them are immigrants. Okay.
Is that a refugee plant? They planted out. So yes,
no, but the company themselves sponsored people, to come.
So there is no such a visa in which you can sponsor a worker unless it's for a very, very specific program, or they are very limited and you need to find a way of really working around the constraints. So we can go a little bit into detail, but my view is that there should be many more companies that do what this company goes on PBS because, seems like every company should be able to do something like this with visa, and it's very complicated. It's very hard. If you talk to employers, it's very, very hard.
Jim, we'll make yours the last question.
This is go in a totally different direction. With your message and your research and what we're experiencing with the political situation, do you have any personal fear that you will be singled out, you and your colleagues' work will be singled out by a political site that will bring you down? Do you have any fear? And do you have any fear that it will affect UC Davis and that they may have to negotiate with the government to stop doing what you do because it's so counter to what the president wants?
So I have been doing this for 20 years, and I can bring you the email of hate that I got by some people who are regularly kind of despise my research. UC Davis has been a place where so far my kind of freedom and activity, it has become harder in the last couple of years to get grants. I can tell you that. Yeah. Some of these foundational places, they are a little bit harder. But on the other hand, I feel like there has also been a part of the society, not the government, but in the journalism world, in the academic world, a lot of people who are feeling that this is the time in which we need somebody to put up this. And as I said, except for the first two slides in which I was talking about sentiment, I always talk about data and I always talk about evidence. And so I am very happy to have a debate and to see different evidence. What I want to allow, and I will keep doing, is some people who don't like the final results and tell me not to do it. So far, nobody has told me not to publish these things because of what I find, and hopefully that will stay.
Hopefully that's right.
Well, let's once again thank Giovanni. I just want to add that one of the things I got from your talk is Jesus was actually a very good economist too, because he told us to take care of our immigrants.
I agree. That should be a new musical. Jesus Christ, super economist. How about that?